Hello and welcome to another Times Radio question and answer. Today we're answering questions and comments from our channel members on frontline videos and current conflicts and their impact on the world stage. I'm Philip Ingram. I'm a former senior British military intelligence officer and global commentator on all things defence and geopolitics. Now our first question comes from Steve. Steve has moved from Ukraine, but it's still related to Russia. And he said, I've seen a report that the new Syrian leadership is going to allow the Russians to stay in Syria. Of course, maybe the Russians are going to pay for the privilege of having their bases in Syria. Governments don't run without money. So to have some more details making this judgment. It does seem strange seeing how the Russians have murdered thousands of civilians. Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in Syria over the coming days and weeks, because Russia hasn't endeared itself to the rebel forces that have moved in. Remember, the Russian Air Force, only a few days before they managed to push Bashar al-Assad out, were bombing Aleppo and bombing the rebels as they were coming down. So their desire to keep Russian air forces in place, I think, will be slightly influenced by that. And of course, we've got the Russian air base and we've got the Russian sea base at Tartus, which is the headquarters for the Russian Mediterranean fleet. The Russians seem to have evacuated a large number of the vessels from there. Where they've gone to isn't clear yet. That hasn't been reported. But we're seeing Russian troops and Russian Air Force troops securing some of the areas that they've got. And a lot of those are outside the areas that the HTS, the rebel force that has pushed Bashar al-Assad out. And what their future is going to be is unclear. I think there will be negotiations, and the Russians may try and buy their continued presence in Syria. It is strategically very important for them, not just because of the bases. And those bases are used as staging bases for Russian operations into Africa. So if Russia is pushed out of Syria, it's going to impact their operations in Africa quite significantly. But also, if Russia can say it maintains that interest in the Middle East, it can put that out to its strategic partners. And we've got, of course, Iran, China, North Korea, and the other BRICS members that are there. So politically, it's important for Putin to try and save face with what's going on. But from a military perspective, the rebels, the HTS in particular, I think are going to have to very carefully bite a bullet or bite their tongue to allow the Russians to stay, given that it's the Russians that bombed and enabled, all through the civil war element, enabled the use of chemical weapons, Bashar al-Assad using chemical weapons against the people that HTS have been protecting for quite some time since the ceasefire came in. So it's early days to call. We don't know what stability there's going to be throughout Syria whatsoever. We know that the Russians have been severely embarrassed by what has gone on inside Syria, and that is having wider geopolitical consequences. Again, it's too early to say what those are properly going to be and how they're going to properly play out, but it's something that will be concerning Putin. Militarily, is it going to throw up more troops that Putin can use on the front line in Ukraine? Not really, because the majority of the troops in Syria were there with the Air Force supporting air operations, or the likes of the rump of Wagner that have been operating there, and he's got other places that he'd want to move them. So significant geopolitically, significant strategically for Russia, but it won't have a direct impact really on what's going on the ground inside Ukraine or Russian influence elsewhere. So our next comments come from SmartGram. I don't know your name. Please let us know and we'll bring it out in the comments. But it's a very interesting point, and she asks, when someone with the power to act is going to take the steps to free up all of the sanctioned money in the West for Ukraine's use, and who will that be? Well, we're starting to see some of that being used at the moment. We're seeing the interest from the Russian assets. So the money that their assets and their investments are making in the West being used, and that money is being sent to Ukraine or being used to fund support into Ukraine. But the capital assets that are there is something completely different. I think this is something that we may see Donald Trump begin to deal with. And when he gets in, I think he will want to have some more stronger political levers that he will use against Vladimir Putin to try and pressure him. And those levers could be an enhancement of military support to Zelensky in Ukraine. And I do think that's a distinct probability, slightly stronger than a possibility. But I think from a geopolitical perspective, the way to hurt Putin and the way to hurt his oligarchs is to hurt them in the pocket. And he'll hurt the Russian state properly by hurting it in the pocket. And we saw when Trump was trying to deal with issues beforehand, he tried to influence the international oil price so that those that were relying on oil revenue for actions against the United States or United States interests couldn't get it. We'll start to see potentially that happening, but the other way is to try and not just freeze Russian assets, but to seize the Russian assets and use those to provide the support. That would get Trump around the accusations that he's using US taxpayers' dollars to do it. And I think that would stand up within his party. So the 20th of January is going to be very interesting. If Trump wants to stop this war within the 24 hours that he said, and that's physically impossible, but we're going to see some very bold moves coming out of him. And I think, Smart Gran, you might have just hit on one of them. So our next question comes from Pete Perro, and it's an interesting one, and thank you for putting it in after last week's Q&A. Please feel free to put questions, comments and other bits and pieces below, and we'll try and answer them when we do this again. But he asks, what can Ukraine do if Trump sides with Putin? That's a big if, and it's an assumption that a lot of commentators have dealt with, given the comments that have come out of Trump and the comments that have come out of Trump's team through the election. And I think there's been an assumption that Trump is going to side with Putin. And I, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, would have said, yeah, Trump's going to side with Putin. He will be a disaster for Ukraine. I'm actually changing my mind. And one of my favorite quotes is, if you never change your mind, why have one? I've changed my mind. And the reason why I've done that is if we look at the reason behind a lot of the comments that were coming out from Trump's team through the election, the United States presidential election, and drill into what people were saying. They were saying their comments that came out as anti-Ukrainian, but when you examine them, they weren't. They were anti the fact that the Democrats and Joe Biden didn't have a coherent and long-term plan for Ukraine. So they were criticizing Joe Biden. They weren't necessarily criticizing Ukraine. Now, some of Trump's commentators jumped on the fact, and they themselves, including at one stage his new vice president, jumped on the fact and pushed it out as a criticism against Ukraine. I think a lot of that's being reined back in again. And of course, when it comes to Vice President Vance, the vice president doesn't seem to get involved into much geopolitics in the United States. You know, we hadn't heard of Joe Biden when he was Obama's vice president on the geopolitical framework. Who was Kamala Harris until she became the presidential nominee. So comments that are put out from a domestic political perspective, I don't think we can automatically translate into what's going to be policy in the future. So I think if we look at what's happening in the dynamics since the election, we've seen Trump speak to both sides. He's spoken to Zelensky. Zelensky's come up with a roadmap to peace. He's gone off to Mar-a-Lago and briefed Trump and Trump's team on this. And as part of that roadmap to peace, it's been widely publicized that he was saying he was willing to temporarily give up some of the territory in Ukraine if that stopped the fighting and stopped the deaths and the horrors that are happening, to allow him to then negotiate that back through diplomatic means at some stage in the future. He's giving Trump what Trump wants to hear in the negotiating side. If we look at what happened from when he spoke to Putin, well, did he speak to Putin is the first question. Trump's team says, yes, he did. And then Putin's team, through his spokesperson, Peskov, turned around and said, no call actually happened. But then immediately after that, Putin's team put naked pictures of Melania Trump out on Russian national television. Now, I've mentioned this 2 or 3 times beforehand, but it's quite significant. Given Putin is a former intelligence officer and he thinks like an intelligence officer, a Russian intelligence officer, that putting compromising pictures out of Donald Trump's wife was Putin threatening Trump. And he was threatening him because clearly this phone call that never happened didn't go the way that Putin wanted it to go. And that's why they denied it happened, and that's why the threat came out. And the threat is, if you don't give in to me, if I'm willing to do this, what else might I be willing to do in the future? That puts Trump in a very difficult position, because he's got on one side with Zelensky cooperation, on the other side with Putin a face-off. I think Trump, recognizing what is going on across the globe with Putin's position, that the Russians are on the back foot geopolitically in the Middle East, there's an opportunity to send a message to Iran, to send a message to China, and send a message to Putin and threaten him back or turn those threats into actions. I think we're not going to see Trump necessarily siding with Putin. I think we might see Trump siding with Zelensky and the Ukrainians. And won't that be a turn for the commentators? I wonder how many will turn around and say, I've always been suggesting this, but we'll see after the 20th of January. But a good question, thank you. So folks, that's all for this question and answer episode. If you want your questions on the war in Ukraine or elsewhere and its impact answered, please sign up for Times Radio membership today and put your comments and questions below each of the videos. But thank you very much indeed for watching. Goodbye.